welcome to the session. Hopefully you have all enjoyed your morning. My name's Chris, I'm from the General Medical Council, and I will talk a bit about my role very shortly, but I'm going to introduce you to some of the most recent GMC guidance, which actually hasn't gone live yet. So it was published at the end of September and goes live actually this coming Monday, so Monday the 9th of November, and it's our decision making and consent guidance. If you've got any questions, please do use the chat function as we move through the session. Would like it to be as interactive as possible. As we move through the slides, feel free to ask any questions that you have, and if we have time, we will get to some case studies at the end. And at that point, I will be asking people to feed back and answer the questions that we've got. Before we get started, before we start looking at the actual content of the session, just want to say a big thank you to all of you on the call. Really, if you are a doctor and you are working in the NHS already, then we really do appreciate the hard work that you are doing at the moment, and will continue to do for the coming months. And if you are a medical student, then appreciate that things are probably very different for you at the moment, and we appreciate the efforts that you are putting in. So just want to say a big thanks to everyone on the call for the continued hard work and commitment. We really do appreciate that. Just want to quickly introduce who I am, why I'm sat at my laptop talking to you on a Saturday afternoon. So I am part of the GMC Regional Liaison Service. So my team at the GMC was set up about 8 years ago, really because of feedback from the profession and the GMC realizing that we weren't getting out and speaking to doctors as often as we should be. We weren't engaging with the profession as well as we perhaps could be. So that is really my role at the GMC, to meet with medical students, to meet with doctors of all different levels, and to talk about the roles of the GMC to improve everyone, medical students and doctors' understanding of and awareness of our guidance. But most importantly, I think, is to be that face of the GMC, somebody who medical students and doctors can talk to, can ask questions, can raise issues with whenever they meet with us. So prior to the pandemic and the country going into lockdown back in March, I would have been out and about 3 or 4 days a week visiting medical schools or trusts around the UK, and delivering sessions very similar to this. So this is very similar to a session that I would be delivering usually face-to-face, but for the last 8 months we have been delivering sessions like this and trying to get used to the virtual world. So hopefully this goes okay today. As you can see by the map, I have colleagues all over the UK, so wherever you may be based in the UK, whether that's up in Scotland, over in Northern Ireland, Wales, all corners of the UK.
Hey, Chris, just as a heads up, the screen isn't actually sharing right now. If you just go ahead and click that third button again.
Do apologise.
No problem.
There we go. Can we see that
Perfect. Now? Yep, excellent.
So hopefully what I've just been saying now makes sense, as you can now see the map in front of you. So as I say, I'm based just in the northwest there. So the third picture down on the left-hand side, you'll see myself there. I'm based just outside of central Manchester, but have colleagues all over England and in the devolved nations as well. So wherever you are based in the UK, or wherever you move to in the UK in the future, you should have a representative from the GMC who is there delivering sessions to you and engaging with you from a GMC point of view. So very quickly, just want to recap on some of the key roles that we have at the General Medical Council. I'm not going to talk about these in too much detail, but the top of the jigsaw here, we've got education, and probably an area that not all doctors are aware of in terms of the GMC's role. So we are responsible for setting the standards for undergraduates, so medical schools and medical students, training and education, and also for postgraduates, so doctors who are in a training program, the training and education that they receive. So if you're at medical school, if you're in a training program, at the GMC, we are ultimately responsible for the standards of the training and education that you are receiving. And can everyone still hear me okay? I keep getting a message coming up saying I've been muted. I've unmuted myself. Hopefully you can all hear me, but just to reiterate the importance of our role in terms of education and training. And if you are at medical school at the moment, if you are a doctor in training, I think it's very important that you have that awareness of that role. And if you feel that your education and training is being affected and you're not developing as you should be, because of the pressures being created during the pandemic, then we are there to help and support, and you can contact us to discuss those issues. And really just wanted to highlight that. Also hold the register of all doctors who want to work in the UK. Revalidation is something that all doctors have to do every 5 years, and we're not going to talk about that in any detail now. Fitness to practice is probably the most high profile area of the GMC's work, and the area that doctors want to talk to us about the most usually. We're not going to focus on that during this session, but if you do have any questions about that, feel free to drop them in the chat box and we will talk about them in a bit more detail. And then finally, in the center of the jigsaw are the standards that we produce, and those standards underpin all of the work that we do. And ultimately, that's my role at the GMC, is to come and talk to doctors and medical students about the standards that are in place to help and support you on a day-to-day basis. So here is a selection of the guidance and standards that is available. You can see in the middle of the slide there, we've got good medical practice, which is our key piece of guidance really, and that underpins all of the other guidance that we've got in place. At the top of this slide, excuse me, you can see a selection of the detailed booklets that we have in place, covering some of the key areas. So we've got confidentiality, we've got raising concerns, and we've got our decision making and consent guidance, which looks slightly different to all the other pieces of guidance because, as I said at the start, it is the most recently updated piece of guidance, and that is the area we're going to focus on for the next 40 minutes or so. Just want to highlight the guidance at the bottom, which looks slightly different, and that's what we call supplementary guidance. So those pieces of guidance are usually 1 or 2 pages of A4, and they are much more focused on very specific issues. So you can see from some of them there, we've got acting as a witness in legal proceedings, we've got maintaining a professional boundary between you and your patient, and over on the right hand side, we've got a piece of guidance that focuses particularly around doctors' use of social media. So this guidance is produced to answer and assist issues in particular areas that are starting to occur more and more regularly. So do have a look on the website. All of this guidance is available, and you can familiarize yourself with this and use it to help and support you. So hopefully during this session, we're just going to introduce the new consent guidance. And as I say, it is the most recently updated piece of GMC guidance. Isn't actually live yet, but hopefully we're going to increase your understanding and awareness of this new piece of guidance. We'll talk about some of the key changes that you would need to be aware of it. And we'll just have a discussion, hopefully, about what that means to you as either medical students or currently practicing doctors, or perhaps if you are thinking about a career as a doctor in the future, what this guidance might mean to you. So this is the guidance. As I've just said, it looks very different to all other pieces of GMC guidance. It's a different color to start with. And first and foremost, the biggest change in terms of this piece of guidance is that the title has changed, and it used to be called consent and decision making. So there's very much a focus on the consent aspect, and obviously that links into the laws around consent and the importance of that. But actually, we've flipped it round for this guidance, and the focus is very much on it being about decisions that are made and that decision making process, because consent is very much a point in time where a patient agrees to a form of treatment or examination. But actually, there are going to be decisions that are made on an ongoing basis, and decisions are likely to change when you are treating patients. So the guidance is very much focusing on that ongoing decision-making process, which links into forms of consent. So we'll try and cover that as we move through the session. The new guidance, and the reason that the guidance was updated was because we wanted to take a much more proportionate approach to decision making and consent. And previously, we had guidance in place and we expected doctors to be following all aspects of that guidance. But what we have realized is that decision making and consent is a very complex area, and it's not always going to be areas that you can cover in terms of the guidance. So the questions coming in, Macaulay, can I see those somewhere? I apologize. I can answer the questions as we go if I can view them.
You are more than welcome to look at them, or after the session, we could do a Q&A. It's completely up to you. Which would you prefer?
I'm happy to pick them up as we move through. Yep, probably.
So you're more than welcome to do it this time, and then going forward, we will put them, we will copy them and paste them into the backstage. So it's just the questions that are coming through, which is a little bit easier for you to filter through.
No problem.
Brilliant.
So are they on the stage? I can see.
They're on the stage. Yep, that's
absolutely. So
brilliant.
I can see the questions coming through, and the first one: when will the booklet be live? So the guidance is already available on the GMC website. So sorry, I'll go back to that. So it actually was released on the 30th of September. So it's been on our website since the 30th of September, and we've been delivering sessions like this to try and increase doctors' awareness of the change in the guidance. And it goes live, as I said, this Monday, so Monday the 9th of November. So we've had sort of a 6-week lead-in period, if you like, to allow doctors to familiarize themselves with the guidance, and then it to go live this coming Monday. As we go through the session, hopefully you'll realize that things haven't changed drastically. The laws around consent haven't changed. So the guidance is more about, as I said, it being more proportionate and more supportive, hopefully, and helpful for doctors who are practicing it. And we'll talk about those points as we move through. So just picking up, around certificates. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if you get a certificate for attending the whole day, but we don't give certificates out just for the GMC sessions. But I can see actually a comment there. So, yeah, so certificates are issued at the end of the session. Question there from Georgina. So could this also apply to other health professions such as paramedics and physiotherapists? So this guidance is just for doctors, but in terms of any career in medicine, you have to consider consent. And when you are treating patients, consent will always be, a key aspect of that, and that will be the decisions that are made. And I think it's certainly, these principles that we will talk about certainly apply to other healthcare professions, even though the guidance itself may not particularly apply directly to you. So we talked about the principles, the proportionate approach, sorry, and the reason that the guidance was changed is because we wanted it to be more proportionate. And one of the first paragraphs of the updated piece of guidance actually says that not every paragraph of this guidance will be relevant to every decision that you make with or about a patient. Your judgment about how to apply the guidance will depend on the specific circumstances of each decision, um, and then lists a number of the circumstances involved. So it's very much focusing on doctors using their professional judgment in how to apply this guidance and the principles that we will talk about. So not expecting doctors to be following every single point within the piece of guidance. We are expecting you to know the guidance and understand it, but be able to apply the principles in each individual scenario that you are faced with. So one of the big changes to decision making and consent is that we have introduced the 7 principles of decision making and consent, and this is one of the big changes to the new guidance. And we'll just run through the 7 principles here and talk about them in a bit more detail. So if we start in the middle, a key point to the decision-making process is that patients must always be involved and supported to help them make informed decisions. And I think if we link that back to other perhaps medical careers in medicine, then that would link into those areas as well, that you need to ensure that your patients are always involved and supported in those decision-making processes. And the way to do that, if we sort of follow it round to the right-hand side, is to ensure that these conversations are always ongoing. So it's not a one-off decision that a patient's making, should be ongoing conversations which are keeping the patient involved in the process and making sure that they know where things are up to, and that they can perhaps change their mind if they want to change decisions that have already been made, that they can do that. So it needs to be an ongoing process with meaningful dialogue and conversations taking place. If we follow it down to the box underneath that, we need to ensure that all of our patients they have the right to be listened to and have time and support available to them. So we shouldn't be putting pressure on patients to make decisions. They've got to have time to consider the decisions that we are asking to make, got to ensure that they've got support around them if that is needed. And the key point is probably the first 4 words, that patients have the right to be listened to. So you need to give patients the time to ask you any questions and discuss any issues with you, and really, support them to do that. So if you are talking to a patient about potential future treatment, they're likely to have lots of questions about that, and you've got to give them the time to ask those questions and give them the time to reflect and think about the discussions that you are having with them. The bottom right hand corner, so doctors must try to find out what matters to and share relevant information. So this again is one of the big changes to this new piece of guidance. It focuses very much on the patient as an individual and what matters to that individual. And what we are focusing on here really is doctors taking the time to understand about the individual needs of that patient, and things that we are perhaps wanting to take into account here is if you are suggesting a certain course of treatment, maybe a form of surgery is required to treat a patient, it's vital that we know what impact that might have on the patient's life. So we think about we are thinking about what those patients do in their free time. What are the hobbies that they have got? Do they outside of their everyday life, do they like reading? Do they spend a lot of time reading books? Do they play lots of sport? What are their outside interests, and what could the potential treatment that you are suggesting, what could the potential impact be on those outside interests? So we've got to get to know our patients and understand how things might impact them as an individual. So really important that we do bear that in mind, and that can only be done by spending time and talking to patients. So we'll just follow it round, and I can see quite a few questions coming through there. I'll come back to those in a second. So we've got, is consent affected by law? If consent is affected by law, then we've got to ensure that there is support and involvement from those available to the patient. So ensuring that they are aware of the laws that are impacting on that consent. And then if we go to the top left, we've got the presumption of capacity, and we should only be judging that a patient lacks capacity when we've been and assessed them, and we are carrying out an assessment at that specific time and related to a specific decision. So we're carrying out an assessment of a patient's capacity, and that is a point in time assessment focusing on specific decisions that we would require the patient to make. And if we assess a patient and we are of the opinion that a patient lacks capacity, then it's vital that their best interests are considered and decisions are made in the best interests of the patient. And that will be done by consultation with the wider team, involving everybody in the decision-making process. If the patient's got friends and family who are supporting them, then we will take their views and opinions on board, and we will think about how to make the best decision in the interests of the patient. So a number of questions coming through. I'll just take time to have a look at them. So for probably one most relevant to this slide is, are the 7 principles only a modification? So I guess they're a modification in terms of how the guidance is set out, that all of the points on the slide here were already in the previous guidance. We have just made them clearer and made them into these 7 principles. So areas such as capacity have always been involved in consent guidance, the fact that patients should be involved in the process and they should be having conversations and dialogue, the fact that we need to know what matters to patients, in their personal life and the hobbies and interests that they have. Again, that was always in the previous guidance. We've just made it much clearer, I think, and made it easier to focus on, 7 principles that are here. So in that sense, I think it is just a modification. It's making the principles more clear and hopefully more user-friendly, so doctors can clearly see the points that we want them to be considering. So considering the doctor must involve these 7 principles when making decisions, do we think that a robot could ever replace doctors and still carry out these principles? I think that is very unlikely to ever happen. And as I said right at the start, it's about doctors using your own judgment and your professional skills. So these are conversations that you will already be doctors will be having these conversations with patients already, and this is not change. This shouldn't be changing any ways in which doctors are already practicing. You should be involving patients in the decision-making process. You should be having those conversations with them. If you assess a patient and are of the opinion that they lack capacity, there are things that you have to do in terms of supporting those patients and helping ensure that the correct decisions are being made. So certainly don't think that this is anything new to doctors and should change the role of a doctor moving forward. So there's two questions from Umesh. So when will GMC get regulation right and look at Ian Patterson, who harmed many patients? So there's been an inquiry into Dr. Patterson, and it's been ongoing, and we are considering the recommendations and taking the required action in terms of Dr. Patterson. And again, from Umesh, is the GMC racist, or is the GMC going to, what is the GMC going to do about racism? So absolutely, I would say the GMC is not racist. We recognize that there are issues within the profession and things that we need to consider, and we are always reviewing our processes because we recognize that certain groups of doctors are more impacted and affected by our fitness to practice processes, and all of that information is available on our website. You can look at the data around that, and we are constantly reviewing that data and looking at our processes to try and understand why certain doctors are more likely to be referred to the GMC and investigated by the GMC. So lots of ongoing work in that area, and we recognize that there's much more that we need to do in terms of equality and diversity, and the role that we can play in that through sessions such as this that we deliver, and how we work closely with doctors and the organizations that you are working in. So lots of information on our website, reviews that have taken place, information available, and I can send links about that in the future. Question here: if a child has told you personal information which is serious, like depression, would you have to tell someone like the parents? What if they don't want you to tell them? What if telling someone will affect them? Won't telling someone will cause you to lose their trust, especially if they don't want you to tell anyone. If you kept the information and didn't tell anyone, would this be against the law? So that question there is very much thinking about patient confidentiality, and confidentiality is one of our key pieces of guidance, and that trust that patients have in you, underpins confidentiality, I think. So patients they've got to trust you as doctors, and they've got to be confident that if they come and see you and they open up to you, and patients will tell you as a doctor things that they've never told before, never told anybody else in their life. They will come and see you and tell you personal information about them that they've perhaps never shared with their husband or their wife or their children or whoever it might be. And they come and share that information with you because they are confident that that will remain confidential and you won't share that information with anybody else. So patient confidentiality is absolutely key. When we start thinking about children, so we have guidance that relates to this and focuses on patients under the age of 18. And again, patients under the age of 18, they still have the right to patient confidentiality. So just because you are treating a child does not necessarily mean that straight away you are going to share any information they tell you with their parents or other people who are involved in their care. So does make it more complex when we are treating a child, and depends on the age of the child and the issues that you are dealing with as to whether you make a decision about sharing that information or not. So it's difficult to talk about generic cases like that, but if we think about if the example you've given around depression, so if say a 15-year-old child came to see you and you diagnose them with depression, you put them on medication, and you were treating them as you should be. If that patient doesn't want you to share their diagnosis and any information with the parent, then you must respect that patient confidentiality. And the law says that that things should you have a duty to keep information confidential. And if you have a look at our confidentiality guidance, our 0 to 18 guidance, have a look on the website. There are lots of other case studies that you can look at that relate to all the areas that we are talking about. Just looking at some of the other comments that are coming through. So if a patient is carrying a disease, should a doctor say that to the patient, knowing this will affect the patient emotionally? So sure, I totally understand that question. I guess if you, I presume you're thinking there from the point of view, if you are treating a patient and maybe you diagnose them with something that they weren't aware of, or something that they hadn't come to see you about, absolutely you should still be informing the patient of any diagnosis that you are making. So the patient has the right to be informed of any diagnosis that you make. So make sure that you are informing them of that. At what point does the safety of the patient override patient confidentiality? So we're sort of getting off point from consent here, but happy to keep talking about this because there are lots of questions about patient confidentiality. So there are 3 exceptions to the duty of patient confidentiality. So, our starting point is patient information remains confidential and we shouldn't be sharing that with others. But there are 3 exceptions to that duty of confidentiality. And the first exception is consent. So a patient could give you consent to share information with other people. So the example that we mentioned above, if you've got a 15-year-old child as a patient and you diagnose them with depression, then ideally you want them to have the support of their family around them. So you would want them to be talking to their family and informing them of that diagnosis. So you might want to ask the patient if they would be happy for you to have a conversation with their parents, their carers, whoever it might be. But you would ultimately be asking for the patient's consent to do that. And the patient could say, no, I don't consent to that. The second exception is the law. So if the law says you have to share confidential information with whoever it might be, then you have to abide by the law. And for doctors, there are certain things that you have to share. There is information that you have to share with the DVLA in terms of concerns you might have around a patient's fitness to drive. We've also got issues such as female genital mutilation, so FGM. And if you have concerns that a patient is at risk or involved in that, again, you have a duty under the law to report those concerns. Also things that, we all have to do. So if a police officer arrives at your workplace and they have a warrant or they have a court order and a legal document that says you must give me this information, then you've got to abide by the law. And as we all do, we have to do what the law says. And the final point, and this is the most complex one, and the area that most of these questions come into, I think, is around public interest. So that's where we are treating a patient and we think, actually, the information that this patient has given us, the concerns that we've got about this patient, we need to share these more widely because that would be in the public interest and it would be of the wider benefit to the public at large if we reported these concerns that we have. Now, that is an extremely difficult and complex decision to make, and no doctor should ever be making that on their own. They should be talking to their colleagues, taking advice from their colleagues, and ultimately involving the legal team at the workplace they are at. So whether that be a hospital or a GP practice, they should have some legal support there who can help when making those types of decisions. And the decision that you are making there is really, as Lewis has said, at what point does what point does really the patient of the safety or the wider public override patient confidentiality? And that's the public interest test. Lots of information about that in the confidentiality guidance, covers 3 pages of the guidance, making a decision in the public interest. So very complex decision to make. And again, if you go onto the website, you can look at case studies and you can test your knowledge and understanding around certain areas of the guidance, and confidentiality is certainly one of those. So the point there, what do you do if you completely disagree with a patient? And that is a very difficult situation, but ultimately a patient has the right to make whatever decision they want. So the best example of that may be if a patient chooses not to have any treatment at all. So a patient could come to you, they could receive their diagnosis, and you could tell them that perhaps they need a certain form of treatment to save their life. A patient can refuse that treatment. So it is totally up to a patient to make their own decisions as long as they have capacity to do so. And we've got a case study that looks at that in a few slides time that hopefully we'll get to. Now I'm just looking at the comments still about if you are. So lots of comments about treating children here and sharing information. So we're talking there about teachers, and it may be different for teachers. I don't know the regulations that they have to work under in terms of informing patients, and it is a different relationship really, because pupils maybe tell teachers things that aren't necessarily in confidence, or they're not expecting to be kept confident. Whereas for you as a doctor, if you are working as a doctor in the UK, you have that duty of confidentiality to all patients that you are treating. Does get complex with children, but you're going to have to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And again, considering those exceptions that we talked about, you're really going to be thinking about whether it's in the public interest that you are breaking the confidentiality of the patient that you are treating. So if a decision that was if a decision that a patient has made will affect him or her, what should a doctor do? We've just got to be honest with the patient, really. So you've got to give the patient all of the information they need around the potential risks or the potential benefits of any treatment. So I'll move on. I'm conscious of time, but I will flick through to, and we'll come back to these slides if we need to. But I think this case study probably sums up quite well the sort of conversations that we're having here. So this is a real life case study. This happened. The doctors had to deal with this situation, and it went to court actually for a decision to be made. Because here we're thinking about decisions that patients are making, and potentially whether a patient's got the mental capacity to make a decision in a difficult situation. So here we've got Sam, and Sam has paranoid schizophrenia, and he was detained at a mental health hospital. Now, Sam developed gangrene in one of his legs, and he was refusing to consent to the urgent amputation of his leg. So the doctors told him that if he didn't have his leg amputated, there was a real risk that he wouldn't recover, and ultimately he would die because he didn't have that amputation. Now, all of Sam's family and the doctors who were treating him, they all wanted him to have this treatment. So they were there, they were having these discussions with him, and ultimately the decision was made that although Sam has paranoid schizophrenia, he actually had the capacity to make this decision. So he could decide for himself what treatment he wanted. And Sam ultimately decided he didn't want to have his leg amputated. The doctors disagreed with this decision. His family members disagreed with this decision. But ultimately, there was nothing that they could do. They could have conversations with him, and the doctors. You have to be honest with your patients, and you have to let this sort of scenario. You have to let Sam know. Ultimately, if you don't have this amputation, there is a high risk that you will not survive it, and you will end up dying from this infection. So the doctors were being honest. They were telling Sam exactly what the worst case scenario is and what is likely to happen if he doesn't have the treatment that you think would be best for him. But ultimately, Sam in this sort of scenario chose to make the decision that he didn't want the amputation. And the interesting point about this case is that Sam's decision was actually proved to be the right decision because he made a full recovery. So very unexpected, and obviously not what the doctors were expecting. But Sam made this decision not to have the amputation, and luckily for Sam, he ended up making a full recovery. So things really did go in his favor. But that just is an example of patients and doctors very much disagreeing on the best course of action. And in this scenario, all of Sam's family agreed with the doctors involved and really did want him to have the treatment that they felt was needed. But as we've said, in this case, Sam chose not to, and in this case got very lucky, really. Just looking at the point there. So would he be considered to have mental capacity? Yep. So basically, very much as you've said there, Doctor. The test that the assessment that you would carry out to test any patient's mental capacity is that they can understand the information that you are giving them, that they can retain that information, that they can process and weigh up the information that you've given them to make a decision, and that they can communicate that decision back to you. And that's what happened in the case here with Sam. I think the fact that he has paranoid schizophrenia is in there to maybe confuse you slightly, and that may make you think he lacks capacity to make a decision, but actually on assessment he did have capacity. So he was allowed to make these decisions. He understood the risks involved of not having the amputation, and ultimately is the patient's decision to make, really. So he went ahead and made the decision that everybody else disagreed with. Just quite a good example there, I think, of how patients and doctors will often disagree on the best form of treatment, and ultimately it's not always going to work out as we expected. I'm just going to skip back through some of the slides here. So just focus on here. That was an interesting comment from Ben there. So if he was under 18, would the doctors be able to ignore his judgment and continue with the amputation? So no, again, with patients under the age of 18, it does get very confusing because there are different things that you need to consider when we are thinking about patients consenting. And if he was, say he was 15 years old, and there's a scenario that we use that's very similar to this, really, where if you've got a 15-year-old patient, that 15-year-old, one 15-year-old patient could be extremely mature, could have a really good understanding of the issues that they are facing and the decisions that they are having to make. Absolutely, there you go, Rohan. So it's about Gillick competence, and that's what you would be applying to patients under the age of 18. And as I was saying, you may have one patient under the age of 18 who is Gillick competent and totally understands the decisions and the issues that you are asking them to make and is happy to make those decisions on their own. But you could also be treating a 15-year-old patient who is, very immature, doesn't really understand, the information that you are giving them, can't make those decisions for themselves. So it's very much treating every patient as an individual and assessing each individual patient. And not, can't deny that treating patients under the age of 18 is a very complex area because you have, a wide range of patients and you're going to have to deal with them all differently. So certainly encourage you to have a look at the 0 to 18 guidance, have a look at some of the case studies on the website, and yeah, just increase your knowledge and understanding in that area. So Eden said, how would you assess a patient to see if they have capacity? So I'll just go back up to, somebody did give us the assessment. So the assessment that you carry out is really just going and having a conversation with the patient, and you're asking the patient to make a decision, and you are testing whether they can understand the information that you are giving them. So if we think of the case study for Sam, we'll come into the end, so I'll focus on that. Think of this case study. So you would be assessing Sam's capacity by, does he understand the diagnosis that you have given him? Does he understand that you are asking him to have his leg amputated, and the consequences of not having his leg amputated could lead to him losing his life? Does he understand that? Then can he retain that information? So we're not testing the patient's knowledge, the patient's memory. We're not coming back in an hour or a day or 2 days to test his memory. He just needs to retain the information that you are giving him for the duration of the conversation that you are having while you are asking him to make a decision. He then just needs to process that information. So he's got to weigh that information up and decide what is best for him. What decision does he want to make? And then the patient's got to be able to communicate the decision back to you. So he's got to be able to explain to you that the information that you've given him and how he's weighed that up and how he's come to the decision that he has in this type of situation. So it's very quick assessment there that any doctor can carry out. Obviously, in more complex issues, so if we look at Sam here, the fact that he's detained at a mental health hospital, that will have meant that a psychiatrist will have carried out an assessment, and there will have been a much more detailed assessment of Sam's capacity in order for him to be detained at a mental health hospital. But that very first assessment can be carried out by any doctor, and you may then want to go away and get some further help and support if you think a patient may lack capacity. So I think how can you confirm a patient's understanding? It's just from that communication with you. So having that conversation with the patient, and does Sam understand that if he doesn't have the amputation, he's likely to lose his life? Can he talk to you about that? Can he explain, how he's weighing up the information that you are giving him in order to make the decision that he doesn't want to have the leg amputated? So it's just very much the conversation and discussion with the patient. So what if a patient is over 16 and doesn't have good understanding or maturity? So our guidance goes up to 18. So in the UK, if you are 18 or below, you are considered to be a child. If you are above 18, then a patient above 18, they may be immature. They may not have a good understanding of the issues that are affecting them, but as long as they have capacity, then they can make their own decisions. I'm just looking at some of the last couple of questions. So are there any scenarios other than not being guilt competent in which doctors disregard the patient's decisions or opinions. So again, very, very difficult to answer questions without looking at sort of specific cases, because all patients will be different. If we're thinking about patient confidentiality, then there may be times when we disregard the patient's views or opinions because we decide it is in the public interest that we need to share this information with the police. So there's a scenario that you can look at on the GMC website that looks at gun and knife crime and how we decide whether we should keep information confidential about a patient who's potentially been involved in some violent crime. So that gives you an idea of how you weigh up those sorts of decisions that we are asking you to make. And other questions that are coming through. Yeah, I think we've covered those few questions. So do put any more questions into the chat box. We are coming up to time now. That's the quick assessment of a patient's capacity. Just want to point out, if a patient does lack capacity, so if you go and assess a patient and you decide they don't have capacity to make a specific decision, then we are going to look at making decisions in the overall benefit and the best interests of a patient. We're going to be looking at evidence of a patient's values, their preferences, any advanced decisions that they might have made, and also thinking, does somebody else have legal authority? So is there a lasting power of attorney in place? Have they given somebody else the authority to make decisions on their behalf? So key things that we want to be thinking about if a patient lacks capacity. As I said, go to the ethical hub. There is lots of information there around making these types of decision. So thinking about assessing a patient's capacity, issues around confidentiality, and the types of consent issues that we have been discussing. We'll just recap quickly the 7 key principles there, as I said, around the changes to the decision-making and consent guidance. For any current practicing doctors, this should not be having a huge impact on the way that you are currently practicing. This will be, standard practice for 99% of doctors who will be making decisions and consenting patients in this way already. This is just clarifying the GMC guidance, making it clearer to understand, hopefully. Just want to point out for any practicing doctors, I'll come back to the couple of questions that we've got on there in a moment, but we absolutely recognise it's an extraordinarily difficult time for anybody working in the NHS at the moment, particularly for those practicing doctors. We have got a specific section of our website available that can just answer questions that you may have around issues related to the pandemic. So if you have questions, please do have a look on the website. And just want to highlight really the importance of doctors at the moment, looking after your own health and your own well-being. You are all obviously extremely busy at the moment. You are concentrating on treating your patients, but I think it is, now more than ever, it's vital that as individuals, you are looking after your own health and well-being. And if you're not feeling well, if you're feeling under pressure, if you're feeling overwhelmed by the circumstances that you are working in, then there is information on the website to try and support you and make sure that you do seek support out in those types of scenarios. I'm not sure we actually covered everything that we set out to at the start. We did talk about the principles of decision making and consent, but then we got slightly sidetracked by questions around confidentiality and treating patients. under the age of 18. There are just a couple of questions that I will come to in the chat box here. So Alexander has said, have I ever had an ethical dilemma in my time as a doctor? And I probably should have said this right at the start of the session, so I apologize for not doing so, but I am not a doctor, so I'm not here to tell you how to treat your patients medically. If we were in a room together, what I would say is if there was a medical emergency, I would be absolutely useless and I would be looking at the doctors in the room to take control. So I would never go and meet with any group of doctors that I meet with on a regular basis and tell them how they should be treating their patients, because through medical school, through the training and experience that you receive, that's what puts you in a position to make those decisions. I just am able to explain to doctors the GMC guidance and how to try and interpret that guidance, because ultimately the guidance is there to help and support you as a profession and as individuals, and to really give you a framework to help you practice in a good and safe way. So I imagine most doctors who are on the session today will have had ethical dilemmas, and they will have had to work through them, often using the colleagues available to them. So you work in large teams. It's important that you're not making those difficult decisions on your own. You should be seeking the support from your colleagues around you. And then final question, I think, what about is that family? Do you mean family decision making there? And some families may make decisions for patients. Uh, yeah, so in terms of families making decisions, families should only ultimately be making decisions if this has been legally agreed. So you need to be sure that there is a legal power of attorney in place, and that will be an individual in place who has been given the responsibility and it's been legally witnessed and agreed that they can make the decisions for the patient. There will be lots of processes locally in the areas that you are working that will help you if you find yourself in that type of situation. But the guidance still applies that decisions should still be made in the best interests of a patient. So if somebody had legal power of attorney and you felt that they were making a decision that wasn't in the best interests of the patient because there's maybe an ulterior motive involved, then you would want to be discussing that with seniors. You would want to be getting legal advice from your trust that you are working in to help you along with those types of decisions. Final question. So Omar said, what happens if someone dies in surgery? Very difficult question to answer. That is, happens regularly, really. Not regularly, but patients do die in surgery. That is just something that happens, and I'm sure to any surgeons in the session or any surgeons that you talk to, unfortunately, they will have had patients who have died in surgery, and there'll obviously be a whole variety of different reasons as to how and why that might happen. Absolutely key in those types of scenarios that you have taken consent from the patient properly. So if you have taken consent following our guidance and the patient has fully understood the risks involved in the surgery, because for most surgery there is an ultimate risk that something could go wrong, and as a patient you could die in that surgery. So as long as the patient fully understands the risks involved and you have taken consent properly, then you will be complying with that aspect of the guidance. There are obviously different questions around, how a patient came to die in surgery, and that would be looked at by your workplace first and foremost. So that, I guess, a key message from a fitness to practice point of view, and obviously there are a few questions about questions and complaints, but if you're a doctor and you make a mistake at work, and if that mistake led to a patient dying or something going wrong in the treatment of a patient, that should be looked at by your employers first and foremost. So it should be investigated locally to find out exactly what's happened and what's gone wrong. It shouldn't be, if an incident occurs, it shouldn't lead to referral to the GMC straight away. There should be lots of work done locally to try and figure out what's happened. If there are concerns about a doctor's performance or what's gone wrong, ideally, again, that should be managed through local processes, and only if it is an extremely serious incident or error that's occurred is it likely to come to the GMC, really. So very, very difficult for me to give examples of patients, of doctors being taken to court. It does happen, and if you listen to the radio or turn on the TV, you will see that the world that we live in at the moment, the culture is where there's a blame, there's a claim, and doctors, patients will now more than ever, I think, try and make clinical negligence claims. But if a clinical negligence claim is made against you as a doctor, that should be, again, managed through the organizations that you are working in, and they would take responsibility for that. Just because a clinical negligence claim is being made does not mean that that will be also a GMC investigation, and they are very separate issues. We do not get involved at all in terms of clinical negligence and complaints that are made to try and claim against a doctor. So there will be lots of examples. If you look at the BMA or the defence unions that support doctors, they would have examples available. So Umesh has given some stats there. I don't know. I will take Umesh's stats as given there that 46 doctors have been charged with manslaughter in the UK, and 90% are black and ethnic minority. Again, they are decisions that are made by the police, and they are criminal investigations that are carried out. So for any form of criminal investigation, if a doctor's charged with drink driving, if a doctor's charged with manslaughter, if a doctor's charged with assault or sexual assault, if you receive a criminal conviction, that is automatically going to lead to a form of a GMC investigation. But fitness to practice is a whole other area that we could talk about for a long time, and we do run lots of sessions focusing on fitness to practice. So it's very difficult for me to comment on individual cases, and I wouldn't like to do so, because I haven't been involved in any of those cases. I don't know whether they've been referred to the GMC. I don't know the background to those cases, so very difficult for me to comment on those, unfortunately. But hopefully you found the talk useful. Obviously we covered areas that we perhaps didn't set out to at the start, but I think it's much better to spend time answering questions and discussing things that are useful to you. I've got my contact details there, so feel free to contact me separately. You can email me. You can look at setting up different sessions for individual groups of doctors if that would be helpful. But I do have sessions coming up in the next couple of minutes, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Again, as question around somebody dying in surgery, that's not something that we can really get into much detail about at the moment, but just focus on the consent aspect if you are concerned about those sorts of issues. But we'll wrap things up there, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Got some different sessions coming up, so if you are interested, please do join me for those sessions. See, a few people can't see the email. If you go onto the GMC website, if you look at our outreach service, you will be able to find a copy of my email address there. So feel free to have a look on the website and find my details. I will leave you all there. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.